welcome to the Market Requirements Retail and Food Service Traceability Trends webinar. We're really excited to have everyone here today. Just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all registrants to view at your own pleasure in the future. But I just also want to just kind of get this started and reiterate the fact that this is really focused on the North American market, and we'll have a lot of discussion around the FSMA rule and those implications, but we will also talk somewhat about global markets as well. Seafood is a global, internationally traded item, and of course, this will have implications globally. So I do want to say that we will be touching on that as well, but the main focus will be on the US market. And at this point, then I'm going to hand it over to Erin Taylor from Whole Chain. She will be moderating today, and she's going to take over from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. I'm Erin Taylor. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Whole Chain. We are a traceability solution for trust, transparency, and coordination across supply chains. Over the past few years, we've really seen traceability take center stage across the seafood industry, not only as a regulatory requirement, but as a core expectation from buyers and certification schemes and consumers. So today's discussion will focus on what's happening right now in the market, regardless of some of the shifting timelines and uncertainties for what's going on in the regulatory space, and what this all means for the supply chain. So as many of you know, the FDA recently announced a 30-month delay in the enforcement of FSMA 204. That's been a big headline, but today we want to offer some perspective about how you should still be thinking about traceability for your business. So we'll hear directly from our key leaders and co-panelists who are really at the heart of this work. So the reality is that traceability has never been just about any one particular regulation. The systems that companies are building, the investments being made are really grounded in deeper, longer-term drivers like sustainability, risk mitigation, human rights due diligence, brand trust, business efficiencies, market access, and on and on. These systems are not easy to do and set up, and they're certainly not easy to undo. And in our global marketplace, the drivers of traceability are beyond just US policy. So while timelines may shift, all the indications we've seen so far are that the market is moving forward and buyers are really setting the pace, continuing forward as they had been. So if you've been waiting for regulations to dictate your next move, you may already be behind. And traceability is a strategic capability, not just a compliance checkbox. So we'll really unpack that today, what that looks like, evolving buyer expectations, some practical guidance for suppliers, and why digital traceability remains critical. So let me introduce our panelists before we dive in. First, we have Steve Phillips, the Group Manager of Seafood at Wegmans, a regional supermarket chain in the US and one of the leaders in retail traceability implementation. We have Sarah Lewis, Director of Programs at Fishwise, which provides innovative market-based tools and expertise in sustainability, human rights, and traceability best practices, and works directly with industry, including retailers in the hospitality industry. And of course, Steve Hart, Senior VP at Global Seafood Alliance, which continues to bring education about traceability to the industry through many channels, including this webinar series. So let's get into it. Let's start big picture. The FDA just announced this 30-month delay in FSMA 204 enforcement. How do you each see this news impacting traceability momentum in the seafood space or not?
Who do you want to start with?
Happy to go to Sarah.
Thanks, Erin. It's a pleasure to be here today. So, I mean, for us, whether a company is approaching traceability for GDST standard alignment or mitigating IUU risks, our advice has kind of stayed pretty consistent, which is in line with what your introduction said. It's basically, this is something that supply chains need to invest in, and not just for one specific reason, but for numerous reasons. The companies that we work with are usually interested in a variety of use cases for their traceability data. And so for many years, we've been working with them to get back down to all the way back to sourcing and really understand the specific, not only companies, but the situation on the ground, as it were, with the species and sustainability and the labor conditions as well, all of which is really dependent on traceability. And so our advice is generally just whatever you're able to do, get started. If you haven't already got a third-party partner, often that can be a helpful starting place if you don't have internal infrastructure within your organization. And also remember, you can start small. Every company already has information about the products it buys, and so it's about building on that information and building more connections through your supply chain to have easier data access. So I could go, I'll stop there for now, but essentially just get started and think about the use cases that really apply to your business, whether that's sustainability or regulatory compliance or whatever it may be. Food safety obviously is top of mind.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. Steve Hart, do you have some perspective on this for us?
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Those are really great insights. And so, just a little bit I have to add to that is, first of all, if you think about FSMA, it's a U.S. regulation. Food safety is not a U.S. regulation. Food safety is universal. Yes, there are governments all around the world that have food safety regulations, but companies around the world are concerned about food safety. Ultimately, consumers are concerned about food safety. So, what does a delay in FSMA mean? Probably not a whole lot, as we've already discussed. We said this is going to be focused on the U.S. market, and then the first thing I'm going to talk about is the global market. So anyway, I talk to companies all around the world, and digital traceability is of incredibly growing importance. Companies in China, Japan, Europe, and the United States. We hear it all the time. What's happening in digital traceability? How's it going to be implemented? What solutions are out there? And this is going to move forward rapidly. GDST is a great platform, the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, for those who might not know the acronym. But GDST is a great platform to try to get out there and standardize traceability in seafood. And I think that it's getting attention, and people are seeing that, and they're going to adopt it. And we're seeing this, like I said, across regions, across countries. So in the big picture, what's FSMA delay gonna do? I think for the large vertically integrated seafood companies, it's going to have little to no impact on them. They've already been down this path for quite some time, as Sarah talked about. Maybe some smaller companies that are more regionally focused and not quite as advanced in where they are with their technology adoption, they might see this as a brief respite to try to have a little more time to figure out what their approach is going to be. So probably good for them, gives them a little more time to adapt and figure out what fits right for them. But overall, I think it's not going to have a huge impact, and we're still going to see adoption of digital traceability.
Great, thanks, Steve. Steve Phillips, did you have some perspective on this too?
Yeah, so FSMA compliance obviously has been an undercurrent for a while, and as we got closer to that originally proposed deadline, we saw an increase in activity. It's disappointing that the deadline is being pushed back, but fully understandable. I think that when I think about FSMA, we have to remember that it's not seafood specific. It's across multiple high-risk categories, and of those high-risk categories, eggs and cheese and things like that, seafood absolutely has the most complex supply chain, and probably has the most transformations throughout that supply chain, and it's shifting our entire process from tracking by PO number into lot by lot. We have complexities within our own internal supply chain, from our back door to our front door, with 111 locations and 3 DCs and FSMA covering everything. So the additional time is welcome. I'm hoping that as an industry, we don't take our foot off the gas and say that time to prepare will now be used as time to ignore. So I think the folks that already started down the path will hopefully continue and progress, and the folks that haven't engaged yet will see this as an opportunity to get on the ball. But I tend to echo what Steve is saying, that FSMA is U.S. specific. the need for digital traceability and visibility of data back to source is universal.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. And I see in the chat we have, some folks chiming in about we're ready for it, and the delay is not having impact for them necessarily, and they're good to go. I think that's also a good kind of, if we can stay with you for a second, Steve,
Sure.
confirmation that Wegmans, has indeed indicated you're moving ahead with your traceability plans, despite some of these changes. Can you share a little bit more about what's driving the decision? You started to hint at it, of course, but
Yeah, that's correct. Our Wegmans seafood sourcing policy has not changed because of the FSMA 204 enforcement delay. And that's because even though FSMA compliance is written into our sourcing policy, it's never been the exclusive end goal. In fact, FSMA was not even mentioned in the first years of our written sourcing policy. FSMA overlaps with the Wegmans goals nicely, however, and it's acted as a non-Wegmans driven U.S. government deadline that's encouraged complementary interest and engagement in our Wegmans seafood supply chain. So if I could, if you could put up the slide, I have this slide that kind of explains this overlap of goals with FSMA and Wegmans.
Yeah, we'll pull that up in 1 second.
All right, so there's a lot on this. I'm not going to read it to you. I'm just going to kind of speak to it. But at the bottom, you see a typical supply chain starting at the source on the left and moving to the right with retailers. In the middle is generic. A processor could be an importer, or a distributor could be a processor, but generally the supply chain looks like this. Wegmans identified years ago that to best serve our customers and make sourcing decisions that they want us to make, we needed information back to source, which is really, really easy to say, but we couldn't find any universal pathway to get to that goal. So we've been observing the work of the GDST, Global Dialogue for Seafood Traceability, for a number of years, as they held dialogue sessions with seafood stakeholders worldwide to come to a consensus on kind of basic term definitions. What's a flagged vessel? What's a port of entry? What are fishing methods? What's a location? When the GDST identified that seafood needed a communication standard, and they began to work to create that, we at Wegmans saw our pathway. We saw the pathway to our goal and became active participants in that effort. So we're all using communication standards right now, right? I'm on my laptop. You might be on your phone or a tablet. We have different connections, different carriers, but it's a communication standard that allows us to all of that to work. And it's the GDST communication standard that will allow our supply chain to work. It's not a solution by itself. It's the pathway. It's a pipeline to fill with data, but we need that pipeline first. So that overarching arrow there, Wegmans wants to see that. Now, FSMA requires the same data reach back to source, right? But they don't care how you do it. There's no pathway, no pipeline, no common language, just the law. FSMA says, figure it out. And then over on the right there, most retailers, Wegmans included, have been putting EDI transmission requirements into place to ensure that their own FSMA compliance across all affected areas, not just seafood, is in place. Now, EDI predates the internet. It's a 1970s technology, but it's reliable and it's relatively easy to implement. But, and this is important, EDI also does not help a direct supplier easily collect all the data required by a retailer. So retailers may end up saying to direct suppliers, well, just figure it out, which is very, very difficult. So we've been working with companies in our Wegmans seafood supply chain to lay this communication standard pipeline for the last 2 years with the intent to be safely compliant by the end of this year with that original goal. It's not been 2 years of consistent work, obviously. We saw increased pace as the original FSMA deadline approached. And in that way, FSMA was very good for our goals. But if FSMA never existed, our goal of data back to source would be the same. And that work that we've done so far, under the deadline of law, has positioned us very, very well. And we decided to hold to our goals of maximizing data visibility in our supply chain by the end of this year. So that's kind of what you're looking at on this slide. You can go ahead and take that slide down. I just kind of wanted to show that we've got a Wegmans goal, we've got a GDST standard pathway, we have a FSMA requirement, and then we have a lot of retailers using that last little step, EDI, to get themselves compliant, but putting compliance back up on the supply chain. GDST covers all of those, that interoperable standard.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. And kind of digging in a little bit more to the supplier side of that, because that's where we get most questions of implementation and the reality of implementation with suppliers. So what are really the most common gaps or misunderstandings you're seeing from suppliers when it comes to fulfilling that overall picture and meeting your traceability expectations?
Well, what I find myself explaining the most is that we're all in this together. I think to some extent our industry is compliance exhausted, right? And some of that has been us spinning wheels a little bit, trying to figure out how do we solve this problem here and this problem here, and then we have all of these problem-solving solutions, but we keep layering more and more and more on top of it. So there's deadlines we can't control. Law will be enforced when it's enforced, but the timelines in our sourcing policy, we're working with our suppliers. So some are relatively simple, single item, vertically integrated. Steve referenced that, those large commodity producers. But then we have partners that source hundreds of items from around the world. And their complexity requires us to get even closer and provide resources to help maybe connect to their ERP system, something that streamlines that. And we really have to have frank and transparent discussions about cost, because more work costs more money. But if we're doing the right thing, it also raises the value of what we're buying. So, I think there's a place here where with open and transparent discussions, we can figure out how is this a shared expense along with a shared success. Our supplier partners often need to be reminded of that, and we understand more effort with no impact to cost is unreasonable. And they might not be hearing the same message from some of their other customers, so it takes a little bit of time to build that collaborative trust. As we've gotten more and more suppliers engaging and having open and honest and frank discussions about their challenges, the work's getting easier. But that first foundational trust building of, hey, we're in this together. No one's getting fired. We're not cutting off anyone's access to market. We're going to work together. It's been successful, but it's the most frequent thing that we probably answer to.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense and really echoes things we've seen as well. And particularly as you spoke to the signaling from other customers and how that really influences how quickly folks move. But we are seeing more and more, and I think folks are experiencing more and more that question and sort of signal from customers. So thanks, Steve. Sarah, I kind of want to shift to you and bring your perspective into this. So Fishwise works really closely with retailers and the hospitality industry and the supply chains relevant to both of those spaces. How are you advising clients to approach traceability today, particularly when some might be seeing these delays as a reason to pause?
Yeah, thanks. I think what Steve just said was really a good example. As he just explained, the ball is already rolling within a lot of companies, so this is already well underway for many. But I would say for those that aren't, we heard from NFI in Boston at the Seafood Expo that hope is not a strategy related to FSMA. And I think that basically this delay, our advice is the delay gives companies that might be a little bit further behind the opportunity to start assessing now how far off they are from FSMA compliance if they haven't already done that assessment, and to really commit themselves to making a plan for becoming prepared. And that includes the really important piece that Steve also just mentioned, which is allocating a budget for this effort, right? So thinking about traceability is not just a conversation about data, it's also a conversation about personnel time and cost for whatever traceability systems you want to put in place. So all of those things take time, and now there is time. So that's an advantage in some ways for those that are a little bit behind. But many of the companies we work with have already started well down the path and are really just working to try to increase maybe the variety of data they are collecting and get that in alignment with things like GDST. So depending on where you are, some of our other advice related to this is to, as I said in my first comments, to really start small. You're already going to have a lot of the information that you need. And so you can create a strategy to fill in the gaps. You don't need to go from 0 to 100 overnight. And so that's it's also important to remember you can't very readily go from 0 to 100 overnight. So again, starting now, you have the time to put things in place. If there is the decision to pause and wait further towards the deadline, then you get into scramble territory at that point. I would also say that, as Steve mentioned, there's a lot of great tools out there for companies. So one of the other questions that we get on, where do I start in terms of FSMA, but not just that, in terms of general seafood traceability, is what resources are out there and how do I make sense of those resources? And, there are lots of companies that can't pay for an advisor. They don't have, like a Fishwise helping them sift the tools in the landscape. And so for those folks, there's plenty of other opportunities to get some of the guidance. So there is tools, or there's guidance directly from FDA. You can go through the National Fisheries Institute. There's GDST, with all of those resources are freely available. And that's something that actually I think not everyone realizes, that GDST is not, it's a free standard. It's not a membership or a group to join, for instance. It's something anyone can have access to and utilize, no matter where they're at with seafood traceability to start with. And then we also at Fishwise and other groups like ourselves have resources available on our website that start helping companies build their understanding about FSMA, build their understanding about GDST. So if you're really at that starting place of trying to understand where you want to begin, there's a lot of resources out there that you can utilize. But the key is to not delay.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, lots of good kind of tips there for folks still looking to implement, and like to focus on the buyer side as well of what Fishwise does. Fishwise really focuses a lot on the holistic view of sustainability with the human rights side and IUU. So can you speak a little bit more about how buyers are thinking about those kinds of risks and why traceability is key in addressing those?
Yeah. So this is kind of where I got my origin in the work with traceability, actually, is in thinking about it related to not just assurance that claims, from the supply chain, things like certification and whatever, are credible, but also for helping companies understand their risk landscape. And data, and specifically very quality data, is crucial for identifying risk. So without data about your supply chain and your products, you cannot make informed decisions, whether those decisions are about operations and dealing with shifting supply chains and tariff impacts, or if that's about human and labor rights in your supply chain. A lot of end buyers are thinking about issues like human rights due diligence. They're thinking about mitigating illegal fishing risks, and there's a lot of collaborative efforts that exist to help understand which data can pair with which risks. So a lot of what we're doing is helping to clarify that landscape in our work. But companies that have invested in traceability have more mature programs for identifying risks are ahead of the game in terms of they're able to not only understand at a high level which products might be based on volumes and maybe source country might be riskier, but really to understand more of the nuances related to the specific types of harvesting methods that are going on, related to issues around in terms of labor, things like time spent at sea. There's a lot of, especially if you're able to get down to the actual source level, the vessel level, you have a much more mature set of options related to risk identification. And therefore, you're able to make more informed decisions about which supply chains to engage more deeply with and which ones to invest your limited resources in. Because a lot of companies, depending on, especially if they're at the retail or the hospitality or restaurant side, they're selling so many things that it really is important to give them a sense of where they can focus. And traceability quality data is a big part of that. And it's also part of the resilience in terms of needing to shift sourcing We saw a lot of things coming out of COVID where companies that had better traceability were able to manage for risks related to supply disruptions and things like that in a better way as well. So I think really the key is that if you have that foundation with traceability, you can then look to a lot of contextual things to compare that data to. So you can look at risks related to labor, you can look at risks related to environmental impacts, sourcing disruptions, illegal fishing, all of that. But you really can't do much with those broader pieces of risk data without knowing your supply chain deeply.
Sage words, Sarah. Thank you. Steve Hart, you've got a broad view of the market from the certification and assurance side. So what are you seeing in terms of buyer traceability requirements evolving recently, including over the last year?
Yeah, thanks. Steve and Sarah set me up pretty well here. You don't have a whole lot to add, but I think Sarah's last comment was kind of a perfect segue into the points I wanted to make, and that is around you have to know your supply chain if you really want to address your goals as a seafood buying company. Whether those goals are environmental sustainability, whether they're social responsibility, whatever those may be. If you don't understand your supply chain, you're not going to be able to really address what your goals are as a company, what your sourcing policies are. And over the last year, I think it's no secret 2024 was an incredibly challenging year for seafood supply chains. As we're in 2025, I mean, this is only proving to be more challenging now in 2025. So understanding that traceability is really important. And what I think what we saw, especially in 2024, certain issues, especially around social responsibility, have become more important. And how does traceability play into that to show that you are sourcing from supply chains that are responsible? And ultimately, if you want to make commitments and have be able to show that your supply chains are doing the right due diligence for human rights, you really have to understand what is in your supply chain. That was loud and clear in 2024. There's and kind of advice that I always give to retailers when I talk to them or food service companies is you have to have a toolbox of compliance. You can't just rely on one thing. And I know Steve addressed that a little bit is, are we creating too many layers of compliance? And I think it's a kind of a balancing act to make sure you have the right mix of compliance tools. But certification is one of those compliance tools. Digital traceability is absolutely another one that is of high importance right now. And I think how we implement digital traceability, there's a lot of maybe discussion we still need to have around that. I think we have a lot of solutions out there that get us to the processing side of things, but going further upstream to farms and vessels, I think it gets a lot more complicated, a lot more cloudy and murky in terms of how we're going to address traceability once you get past the processing plant. Those are kind of the areas that still need a lot of work and development. So that's kind of what I hear when I go out and talk in the marketplace is, what are those, how do we continue to expand what our offerings are now? We feel pretty good about traceability from that, point of processing to the market, maybe not so great about further up that supply chain.
Yeah, and I think what you just said gets into this a little bit as well, but can you speak a little bit more to how certification programs are adapting to these kind of growing traceability expectations and this need to evolve as you're speaking to?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first kind of broadly, I think, you've heard GSA make announcements about traceability. You've heard other certifications out there recently making announcements about traceability. So we all are working on it. We all recognize it is of critical importance to our, to continue to provide value as a certification program, to, drive improvements in traceability technology. So I think all certifications will continue to really work on that and work to implement that. I can only talk about GSA and what we're doing with our standards, and kind of the approach that we've taken. A lot of you probably have heard that we've developed a data center. We're calling it Prism. And really what that does is allows, digital reporting. And I think hopefully to talk a little bit about kind of, the layers that are being created and trying to create some efficiencies to make things easier for seafood buyers is, we really focused on creating a platform that allows for multiple uses. So for example, with Prism, a retailer can go in and they can pull up audit reports in their supply chain and review what's going on in their facilities, look at those audit reports. They can look at analytics in terms of what's happened in those audits. And but then in addition to that, they can also pull up their digital traceability and visualize that, map it out through Prism, and actually be able to look back to what is the source of that product. And it's all digitally laid out for them. And at each point in the supply chain where that product flows, you can look at where lots are combined, maybe where there's significant transformation. It's all captured there and laid out visually for a user. So the goal with Prism was to create efficiencies and I talk a lot about the retailers, but it really has application throughout the supply chain. Think about as a processing plant. If you can implement that technology down to your farms or your vessels, then you have just a better ability, not only to traceability side of things, but also same tools. You can view your audit reports. You can see what's happening with your supply base. So that's kind of where I see the future. And Prism's a new tool for us. We just launched it at the end of last year, and we'll continue to develop new features as we work with the market and figure out what their interests are, and as we work with the producers to see how Prism can be a tool for them. The thought right now is, this is all a voluntary system at this point, and we couldn't make it mandatory at this point. And the reason we couldn't make it mandatory is exactly what I talked about earlier with the farms and the vessels that feed into the supply chain. 90% of our seafood supply comes from these smallholders. And there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to develop technology that will improve traceability at that level. And for us to go through and make something like this mandatory at this point, it wouldn't be adoptable by the vast majority of those small producers. There are a lot of technology companies out there that are trying to address this, but the key thing that we always have to remember with these smallholders is every penny they spend, they have to manage that very carefully. They don't have large margins, and this is their livelihood. So if they're going to invest in a new technology, they need to see an immediate return on that investment for them to want to actually implement this. So as we're looking at how do we improve traceability and get down to that level where the food is actually coming from, where it's being produced, we always need to think back to that producer and what's going to incentivize them to participate in these programs.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Speaking to especially this smallholder perspective, many suppliers, not just smallholders, but many folks are just really overwhelmed, I think, right now by this kind of alphabet soup that feels very new to a lot of folks. They may not have heard of a lot of these things yet. And we've even spoken to some of these acronyms on this call: FSMA, GDST, the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, or SIMP, and so on. So these, this question is really for this whole panel, and feel free to jump in as you wish. But what would you say are the most important concepts to really narrow in focus on right now?
You want me to jump in here first?
Yeah. Yes.
All right. One word, and this word keeps getting repeated, and that's interoperability. We have to be able to standardize these traceability platforms so they can talk to each other. And the more that we can do that, then traceability becomes inclusive and something that everyone can participate in. And I think even kind of looking at and seeing what some of the questions are around costs and pricing, if you and we can't get out there and talk about cost and pricing as a GSA, but I think what we can say is as you create interoperability, that creates competition, and competition is a good thing, and will help drive efficiencies, and part of those efficiencies are costs as well. So that's like, to me, interoperability is the most important thing. And then just getting back to the last point I made was keeping in mind, yes, interoperability is important, but how does that work with the smallholders, and how do you incentivize them to actually want to implement technology?
Aaron, I'll jump in here too. I'll emphatically echo what Steve said. Interoperability. It's the communication standard, the most important concept to understand. It allows all of us to be agnostic to the choice of data platform. Choose an Android phone, choose an Apple phone, it doesn't matter. They're going to talk to each other. Importers, processors, distributors, retailers, we can all choose the platform that works for us. But through interoperability, all of them can speak to each other seamlessly. It takes me back to something that Sarah said earlier. I think, Sarah, you had said something like, without the data, we'll be unable to advance some of the other goals that we might have as companies, whether they're environmental, whether they're social, whether they're food safety. And the genesis of our sourcing policy was hitting exactly the kind of dead end you're talking about, Sarah, where we had intention, we desired to improve, we started working with organizations to try and identify where we could. And the very first question was, great, show us your data. And dead end. We had to stop. So this is so foundational and fundamental to have that interoperability across systems. It's not a new concept. The GDST interoperability standard, that communication standard, it's the same standard that they use in the pharmaceutical industry, which is it's required by law in the United States. That same exact same communication standard. It's a little bit more drug focused than it is fish focused, but they are a high risk, high regulated environment, and they found that this is the pathway, and they're currently implementing it. Other industries are looking at the very same communication standard as well. Beef has traceability issues all the way back to feed, just like we do. Leather has those concerns. Things like lithium. There's environmental concerns. There's certainly conflict areas where that mining is happening. All the same needs that it could all be addressed with the same interoperability platform, the same communication standard. So I can't emphasize that enough, that at least from Wegmans' point of view, we're dead in the water without access to data in order to make the decisions that our customers have put us in charge to make.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. We have two votes for interoperability. Sarah, any pushback on that? Or
I'll carry it. Yes, absolutely. Agreed and echoed. I was going to say a different word for the same idea, which is alignment and standardization. Those words were the ones that came to mind, but they functionally, I'm saying the same thing, which is there's, when we talk about interoperability, there's a few components there. There's, the ability to speak the same data language, which is the GDST standard, is the best in class, standard we have for seafood. As Steve Phillips mentioned, we have other standards in other types of commodities. So we know that approach works. We know that it makes things more efficient. We know that it will help with the other part of interoperability, which is the actual traceability exchange of information. So the technological side, it allows groups like Cold Chain to do their jobs more efficiently and to be able to draw the data through the supply chain as efficiently as we can in terms of the technical process. So, when I started with traceability many years ago, I won't say how many, we were all spreadsheet based, right? And every spreadsheet contained different versions of the same thing. So different ways of expressing harvest, different ways of expressing product type, different ways of expressing even just ways of expressing the names of the suppliers that you had, right? And because it was all entered by the suppliers in whatever version they typed it out. And so we already know from just even standardizing some of the data within companies have taken that on themselves before even we had the GDST to standardize some of that data. So it really is crucial because it has sped up in Fishwise's experience. Having those standards has saved us multiple people's staff time, and we're a nonprofit, and so we don't have the ability to have a huge team, and so the standardization has already demonstrated value even to our little nonprofit in terms of how much data we're able to handle now is, I would say, many orders of magnitude greater, and we have fewer folks that have to interact with actually pulling it from supply chains. So that's what you can get from making these investments, and we've done that through aligning our systems with GDST.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm gonna round out this. I think that this is kind of a good time actually to bring up one of the questions that I'm seeing from the audience. I'm gonna display that here from Julio Osorio. Thanks for sharing this question. So Julio asks, do you think traceability software providers or digital solution providers will take this scenario, speaking to the FSMA delay, I think, as an opportunity to increase the cost for their software license fees? Those are very expensive already. And I bring this up in this point of the conversation because of this concept of interoperability and standardization, because where a lot of the costs are currently coming into play for traceability are indirect costs or inefficiencies that are a direct result of non-standardization. As folks increasingly require traceability, if a supplier is using a traceability system not based on standards, one retailer or buyer might be asking, for one system, another buyer might be asking for another system. And if there's not standardization between those systems, then that supplier may need to be using multiple systems to meet all of these customer requirements. So as a result, suppliers can be paying for redundant technologies and undertaking some of that repetitive data entry that you're speaking to, Sarah. And so this is a perfect example, again, of where these words we're talking about, interoperability, standardization, and its benefits come into play. And think of the email example. Again, for email, no one cares what system you use. That's because there's an actual technical standard behind it. You probably have not paid for email, maybe ever. And the reason for that is because the more you standardize an industry, the more you commoditize software, including traceability providers like ourselves, and you make us compete on better, faster, cheaper. And honestly, that's where we are heading, and to compete on those levels instead. And that commoditization is a good thing for the entire industry. So, anyways, all great responses there.
Can I just add that, like, you then have the resources as those prices of paying for actually getting the information comes down, then you can pivot that resource to actually addressing the risks or to doing other activity. You can reallocate. That's what we've really seen, Aaron, is like, as the cost of accessing the data and the staff time it took for us to get hold of it went down, we were able to pivot more of the resource, the budget that we have with our partners, into the actual risk analysis, into the risk mitigation, into the supplier relationship building and education. So yeah, it really has what you've said. It pans out from our experience as well.
Awesome, thanks. And yeah, I'm seeing some questions come in. We'll continue to answer those too. So if you've got some, put them in the chat. But one other that I wanted to ask all of our panelists is, it's always helpful to have positive stories or examples to look at. And so are there examples of seafood companies who are getting this right, moving ahead of those regulatory deadlines and positioning themselves well with buyers? And what are they doing differently? Again, happy to have y'all jump in as those ideas come.
Well, I'll speak to some of our supply chain. So one of the most complex spots in our supply chain is that we have a handful, 3 or 4 distributor slash processors slash DSD delivery. They're kind of an all-in-one for us, and we move a lot of product through them, a lot of different varieties of product. Incredibly complex. The fortunate side is all of our major suppliers like that, which probably runs a good 60 plus 70 plus % of our seafood through their supply chain. They happen to share the same ERP. And so working with some solution providers and working with our 3 or 4 kind of core supplier partners that are closest to us and the ERP company, a lot of front-loaded work has been done to try and make that as seamless as possible so that there's not all of this data entry point. It's information that's already in their ERP system. It's taken a colossal amount of work, but by having those 3 or 4 kind of lead that charge, that entire ERP now is a case study and that shows that this kind of process can be used, that we can interact with systems like that and streamline these things. And I think they're way out in front of it. One other thing that I'll say is we have a number of shellfish suppliers in our supply chain that have stepped up. Shellfish are not covered by FSMA requirements, so they don't have this, ticking clock above them for compliance before there's some kind of legal implication. But they do understand that they have a high food risk environment that's highly regulated based off of, it was an early identified risk in the ages of paper and not in the ages of ones and zeros. So it's very, very complex and very, very highly regulated, but all paper based. And we have a good handful of shellfish suppliers, including one of the largest in the country, that have chosen to go in this direction of an interoperable standard and sharing that level of information, even though they're not legally required to do so. Again, creating a case point for other folks to look at and say it's doable. And all this space is pre-competitive. This is where people are sharing information. Multiple solution providers, as far as traceability goes, are in pre-competitive environments where they're sharing with each other. How do we make this work? Data is beginning to flow and in between the 2 and in between the 3s and 4s, and as we get more, hopefully 10s and 12s, and it'll snowball. But we've got some really, really good examples of some forward-thinking folks.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. Others?
I'll just
Sarah,
add, I'll just add that, I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of steps involved in this. And I think there's many examples of companies that are ahead in various ways on traceability. So I would say in terms of, the steps, you've got to get the internal momentum within your company to support this, which Steve Phillips has spoken to really eloquently, like how committed the company needs to be committed to starting this journey and investing in it, because it is going to take some time. It takes, some support, whether that's third-party traceability platforms or other types of collaborations that you're joining pre-competitively or whatever it might look like. And then setting up the actual cooperation with the suppliers, which Steve Hart has spoken to. That is a major challenge, is getting the suppliers to understand and buy into that same commitment. And so I think there's many examples of companies that are doing some of those things really, really well. It can be a challenge for all of those things to stack up. We've run into examples where folks have gone down in a direction with a third-party provider that turned out their system didn't exactly meet the needs of the company and they had to pivot. Or they've had a lot of success in one part of their seafood supply chain with the supplier engagement and data collection, but not in others. As Steve mentioned, it can be hard with the smaller scale components of the supply chain, right? So I think, I would just say the key pieces of what those folks are doing differently is that they are trying to digitize their supply chain and get electronic data to the extent they can, because that facilitates it happening more readily. And they are usually, helping their suppliers along through a lot of investment of, clarity in what their asks are. So again, I can't remember which Steve it was that mentioned, folks in the past have kind of broadcast like different needs to their supply chain, and it can get really confusing. The folks that are kind of leading the way have invested the time and energy into clarifying their asks, whether that's through alignment with GDST or other standards that help folks understand exactly what they need to enter in, or whether it's actual supplier education about the importance of the actual traceability itself, and why they're asking. There can be a lot of times suppliers are sitting on data they won't let go of. And so it actually comes down to building those relationships more than the technical barriers. But I would say there's a lot of folks doing this well.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Sarah.
Let's add really quick, and I'm not going to call out specific company names because we're not going to be in a position to endorse one company over another. But there are examples, even getting into India, where there are technology companies working with small farmers in India to help implement this type of technology, and they're able to show an immediate return on investment to those farmers to incentivize them to actually implement the technology. Now, we're still a long way to go. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done to prove out these concepts to make sure these are really going to be long-term solutions. But there is really good work being done out there to help support and develop that technology, especially for the smallholders. And I think it's us as a standards owner, it's the Wegmans, it's the Fishwises of the world. We all need to work together to help support those projects to make sure that they have the lifeblood they need to continue to develop.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, lots of great insights there. I want to make sure we get to some of these audience questions and comments as well before we wrap our time. So I'm just kind of taking a look at things. I see Joe Los Brigada's comment on labeling here. I think that brings up an important other component that we haven't talked about yet, but traceability doesn't stop at just the data exchange. It sort of needs to be visible and scannable and standardized. And even though FSMA doesn't require specific labeling updates, the market overall, this is part of what the market asks are looking like. We're seeing more adoption and requests around things like GS1 128 barcodes, GS1 data matrices in EDI 856 advanced shipping notices, all these sort of standardized labeling capabilities as well. And so this is really something, a component to how companies are thinking about their overall traceability picture. And this is, something that we can probably have another webinar about separately, and something that Whole Chain we've been working with our folks to offer this capability as well for GS1 128 barcodes and data matrices. But it's an important point to bring up on the labeling side, and it's missed at some points by teams that are looking at the traceability picture. So good thing to keep an eye on as well. Another question from Lindsay from a little while ago, I want to go back to. How have you seen I should have displayed that. There we go. Here's Lindsay's question. How have you seen the delay impact smaller restaurants who would be the last step in the data transmission with FSMA and the food traceability rule? I think Joe had also had a comment back here of no impact because there was still sort of growing awareness on those upcoming regulations. Any other perspectives to add to this question?
I think probably what I believe was Joe said in the chat box is probably the best answer. I can tell you from GSA, we don't have the resources or the ability to work directly with a lot of really small non-chain restaurants. It's just a matter of the amount of people you would need to reach an audience that large. We just don't have the resources for that. We're also a small not-for-profit, just kind of like Sarah mentioned with Fishwise. So I think it's going to be absolutely imperative for those small operators to rely on the large food service distributors, the US Foods, the Cisco's of the world, to really meet their compliance. So my encouragement to those small operators is to absolutely be aligned with your distributor and make sure that you understand what their compliance, what they're doing to meet compliance, and make sure you're aligned to that. That's the best advice I could give.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Another question from Juan Marti. Do you see a growing market trend to source seafood from small-scale fisheries? What's the perspective on traceability or the challenges for small-scale fisheries to comply with market requirements? I think we've spoken to some degree on some of those challenges, and as Steve mentioned, the 90% of production coming from smaller scale places. But what else might we add to answer this question?
I'll say that Wegmans wants to engage with more small-scale fisheries, small-scale farming and fishers. The challenge there has always been visibility into the supply chain, because with a smaller scale producer, there can come great rewards with, closer to the product and you understand who's producing it, but great risks because you don't have this kind of institutionalized process to retain data. So with our large suppliers that we've worked with for decades, while we don't have a digital traceability system in place, I do know that I have a less than 12-hour turnaround on any kind of data that I want because we've cultivated these relationships over time and they have resources to apply to that kind of 11th hour need. Small scale fishers don't. And so that's one of the reasons why we're so engaged on this kind of fundamental data exchange process, because ultimately we need to make it as easy as possible for small scale to engage and as easy as possible for us at the far other end of the supply chain to understand where we're sourcing from, who we're sourcing from, and then that does resolve itself into our ability to tell a story to our customers, and that resolves itself into profitability all the way through the supply chain. But simply engaging with small-scale fishers for the sake of engaging with small-scale fishers, the risk-reward is tenuous at best. With clear data, we can reward the folks who are engaging and doing the right things, and we can get credit for it with our customers as well, and hopefully some other people follow us in the marketplace as well.
Great. Thanks, Steve. We've only got a few more minutes here, so I want to take us to wrap up. I would love to hear from each of you just a quick, what's your one sentence sort of takeaway that you want to leave everybody with?
I'll go ahead, Aaron. Since this is a U.S. focused discussion, everyone on this call has access to a phenomenal resource, and that's the NFI, the National Fisheries Institute. If you're looking for a place to start, NFI has a strategic partnership with GDST. Those two organizations, one U.S. based and one globally based, they don't really have any financial pull in this discussion. They're pretty competitive spaces. So NFI has a ton of resources for you that will be U.S. specific. And if you're a member of NFI, certainly have access to even more counseling. And then GDST will give you a kind of a pointer towards what platforms are currently passing the interoperability testing and who might I start with. Aim your clicker towards those two spaces. And if you're not active members of NFI or active members of GDST, I strongly recommend that you try to take a participatory role. It does not necessarily mean a financial role, so that you have a voice at the table for your piece of the industry, because we need to hear from you so we make solutions that are applicable across the board.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about if there's anyone in the audience that is feeling like they're a little bit behind and they're motivated, hopefully, by the conversation to get going. I think one thing that we always say for folks that are embarking on this is really start with having a conversation with your senior leadership and start by developing a plan within your company. So if you're on the call and you're not like a CEO, go chat with your leadership and really emphasize how you're seeing traceability touch your business and how it could potentially help with some of the risks that you're exposed to and compliance and other issues. Because I think that starting with the buy-in and then having a plan in place is essential, and not to delay just because some of these regulatory levers change timelines. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Steve?
All right. Yeah. So we're out of time. So I'm going to keep this really short. It's not too late. You can find a solution, go out there, do your homework. They are out there.
Great. Well said. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, ours would just be people are doing traceability always for more than just FSMA. They'll continue to do that. Things aren't changing and the market is still requiring it. So thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to GSA for hosting. Again, this recording will be shared out. Thanks to the audience for your time today, and stay tuned for next webinar in our series. Thanks, everybody.